Good morning and welcome to this installment of the PBPA monthly webcast series. My name is Surisha Ganta and I'm Counsel and Education Director with PBPA. Please advance the slide one. Today we have Suhail Seth with us to speak to us about managing the risks of overseas volunteer trips. But before we start on today's substance, we're going to tell you a little bit about PBPA. The mission of PBPA is to provide free legal assistance to small community-based nonprofits. We do this by matching nonprofits with attorneys at the leading law firms and corporations here in Atlanta. Attorneys help our nonprofits with their business legal needs. If you are interested in finding out more about PBPA, please visit our website. Our clients are 501c3 organizations that are located in or serve the greater Atlanta community. And their clients are low income or disadvantaged individuals. Our clients are also otherwise unable to afford legal services. If you're interested in applying to be a client, please go to our website. And also on our website, you will find a wealth of resources, including past webcasts, articles, and podcast episodes. In the future, we hope to be able to also share information about upcoming in-person workshops. Now, before we get into the substance of today's topic, I want to give a quick legal disclaimer because we are attorneys after all. Today's information is just general guidelines. While Suhail will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, it is all just general information. Please keep in mind that if you have specific questions regarding your nonprofit specific needs, reach out directly to an attorney. And today's presentation is copywritten. And now I will hand the mic over to you, Suhail.
Thank you, Surisha. Before I begin with the actual presentation, let me just give you a quick background of my practice for everyone. So I'm a shareholder in the Atlanta office of Polsinelli. I'm in the corporate and transactional department, specifically in the mergers and acquisitions group. If anyone who has worked with me at Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta or did some research on me before this presentation, you might be asking, how do you, an M&A guy, qualified? How are you qualified to talk about trips, international trips, and potential liability issues? Well, the answer is around 60% of my practice is M&A. The other 40% is general corporate work, but 100% of my practice involves international cross-border transactions. And within that general corporate counsel work, a lot of my work has been acting as outside general counsel for folks in the hospitality and travel industry. So I currently represent around 45 to 50 travel companies throughout the world that do, stuff that we're going to be talking about today in this presentation. So as I go through it, just a couple of notes real quick. I will use the terms mission and trip interchangeably, same in terms of volunteers and participants. So, know that if I mention one or the other, they mean the same thing. So with that as a bit of a background, I'll go ahead and start now. What I'd like to do is stop my video so there's no bandwidth issues and I can look at my notes as I go through. So if you bear with me there, but you'll still be able to see the screen. And if there's any issue, just let me know. Okay, so the overall theme here is just managing liability and risks for international travel. And in a lot of the nonprofits cases, we're talking about mission trips or just, your general trips abroad. You might have an affiliate abroad, a nonprofit that you work with, a sister company that you give grants to, et cetera, that requires trips for your underlying mission or your charitable purpose. What are we talking about here? Well, in the for-profit world, it's pretty easy, right? I mean, it's mostly the liability issues are the ones that we talk about here, but the one that sticks out in the for-profit world is, you fail to provide the agreed upon trip or service, or if you charge money, you didn't honor the agreed upon price, the breach of contracts type stuff. Not likely in the case of nonprofits, but I just want to mention it nonetheless. The main risks that we're concerned about, one is like misrepresentation, right? You misconstrue or over exemplify a particular experience. Think about your bait and switches, or representing some jurisdiction or country as safe for U.S. citizens or foreigners, when knowing it really isn't. Higher than anticipated expectations amongst your volunteers can probably easily result in dissatisfaction, which then turns into legal action. So misrepresentation is one. Failure to discover and disclose. You aren't liable for the negligent acts of your suppliers or your service providers that are on the ground in these foreign lands, but if any hazards and risks that they might provide, then you probably should fully disclose them to your volunteers and your participants. One example I like to give is, let's say, the most common one that we see in terms of these foreign trips is transportation providers, right? If you know that this transportation provider you contract with down there has had or resulted, has had accidents or issues before that's resulted in injuries, maybe even deaths in the past, then you should probably communicate that information to any volunteers and participants. Now, it doesn't have to be along the lines of, hey, the service provider, there was a death in 1988 or years ago and blah blah blah. But I mean, you just kind of, and we'll talk about this later, in your waiver and release, you give the volunteers enough information for them to make their informed consent, right? So yes, trips to this travel to this country inherently causes or inherently has some issues with respect to it, some risks to it. Transportation providers may not have the stringent requirements that we have in the US, et cetera, et cetera. So you just want to disclose that and give them as much information up front as possible. You can also be liable for your own negligence. Look, travel is much safer today than it was 10, 20, even 30 years ago, COVID notwithstanding, but accidents and injuries still occur. As I mentioned previously, under the law, you aren't normally held liable for the negligence of your suppliers, but if you yourself are found negligent in prevailing, in injury, it could be problematic. A quick note here on the negligence. In a few states, including Georgia, you do have what's called charitable immunity. And what that means is that as a matter of law, charitable organizations aren't subject to suits for accidents or injuries. Like I said, Georgia, we have that, but there are some exceptions. You can be held liable for the acts of a volunteer that's under your charge, where they act under your direction, or where the third party reasonably believes that the volunteer has authority to act on your direction. So there could be an issue there. I'll talk about it a little bit more when we get to the part of the waiver releases. So questions I get a lot is, well, if we have charitable immunity, do we really need a waiver and release? And I always say yes, right? I mean, belts and braces, get the second bite of the apple. Let's say, you have a situation where your volunteer is a resident of Virginia who doesn't have a charitable immunity statute in their jurisdiction, doesn't recognize that. In the course of, say, medical evacuation, they're being evacuated to their home state. Something happens, an injury, God forbid, in Virginia, guess where they're going to bring a lawsuit against you? Probably Virginia. And so, if you have that waiver, it just adds another layer of protection for you. So getting back to our slide here, so we talked about negligence, and then also, you could have any, as I just gave you an example, you could be liable for injuries or accidents that occur at any time during the trip, or, in the course of, as I said, evacuating or anything like that. And the big one now that we're seeing is COVID. Now, obviously there are inherent risks involved with COVID, but I'd like to put this on here because it is a hot button topic. People want to know, well, how do I handle it? You should do some modicum of research into the jurisdiction you're going, and to find out what the requirements are in terms of, inoculations, vaccines, quarantines, and then you should also have a recovery plan, as we'll talk about later, or just a backup plan as to what happens if someone on your trip does get COVID. That isn't to say that, if someone contracts COVID, you're automatically liable for that or any subsequent spread or whatnot, but it is a good idea to do the homework as to what's required in the jurisdiction that you're going to and relay that information to your travelers. Just one second. All right. So in general, the more informed the volunteer participant is, the better and less risky it is for you. As I said from the outset, you want to do the homework on your destination. Actually extend this to clients and say, do the homework on not only your destination, but your suppliers in that destination. And if you can, to the extent you have employees on the ground, do the background check over there as well. This can be general or customized for your trip, as far as the destination goes. But the general idea is you want to be able to relay this information back to your volunteers and participants in the form of practical tips for handling a wide variety of information. So, what do they do if there's a medical emergency? When do you contact the U.S. consulate? Where is the U.S. consulate located, et cetera, et cetera. KYS, know your suppliers. I give this anecdote. I had a client a few years ago that contracted a vessel to run through the Amazon forest. And unfortunately, they did not do any kind of diligence. They just kind of went with the cheapest provider there was online. And it turned out that this particular company had a known history of accidents and whatnot. Unfortunately, during one of the trips, the vessel caught on fire. Luckily, no one got hurt or injured, but had they, had something happen, it would have been really bad on our end because the client just, essentially did zero diligence on the provider of this and kind of went with the cheapest option available. So to the extent you can, do some background checks, do a modicum amount of diligence, a reasonable amount of diligence on your suppliers down there. Does that mean you turn every corner, every stone and look what's underneath there? No, I mean, you want to do some kind of reasonable amount that shows you did a little bit of homework and did, enough checking within reason, within commercial reason that you're comfortable with that supplier. Health and safety information. Again, this is very important now in the COVID era. As I said, giving you an example using COVID, what is the country's inoculation or vaccination requirements for entry? Do we have to go on quarantine immediately upon arrival? What is that country's policy if there is a COVID infection? What about re-entry in the US? Right now we're still mandating testing on the way back. That could change, but you should be aware of these requirements. Beyond COVID, some examples, countries require certain immunizations before coming in. Is there any political unrest or any military or terroristic activities going on in the region, et cetera? So, you need to be aware of these things and you need to be able to relay them to your participants and your volunteers. There are plenty of resources for destination research. These are the ones we typically see and require and suggest you look at. World Health Organization, the CDC, obviously. The State Department has a great country information page that kind of lets it divides the level of risk of certain countries according to color codes and numbers. So level 1, level 2, level 3, et cetera. And then, if you can, do some research on the cultural standards of conduct. This is particularly important in regions such as the Middle East and whatnot, where certain cultural norms that we expect are okay in the U.S. may not be in those regions. But I don't want to single out those countries in particular, but that's kind of where we see this risk the most. And you kind of want to relay this to your folks that are traveling as well. Okay, so now we have the information, we have the diligence. We need to take this information and we need to inform our participants. Again, the idea is you want to be able to relay this information back to your volunteers and participants in the form of practical tips for handling a wide variety of information that we just talked about. There's no need to be granular in detail here. I as a matter of fact, go the opposite direction a little bit. I kind of give them the general background. And then I like to affirmatively state that they're solely responsible for keeping up to date on some of these requirements, but, I'll point you in the right direction. So, you kind of let them know, look, travel in such and such country involves inherent risks. We recommend you look at the State Department website and CDC website to know what those risks are, what the inoculation requirements are, et cetera. That's my approach. Obviously, other clients go in the other direction, and some clients will just, give as much detail as possible. That's fine too. You can go either direction with that. How is it done mechanically? It can be in the form of a handout. You could do a webinar. You could do training before you leave, training when you get there. A lot of folks have a whole application book, and then they give these cultural norms, rules, vaccine requirements, and entry requirements and whatnot. Then they'll have some terms and conditions, and then they'll have a built-in consent form, waiver, or release. It really doesn't matter. It's just as long as you do it, right? So typically what I see is, and what I've done for some PBPA clients in the past, was we'll draft up some sort of combination of a handbook in terms of conditions, and then we'll attach a waiver and release to it. You just really, in an ideal world, you want something in writing and you present it to the participant, and then you want to follow it up with a pre-trip orientation and an on-site orientation when you get to your destination. The goal is just to prove that you have reinforced this messaging as much as possible. As I said, the highest risk to you in terms of injury and physical injury is that some catastrophic physical injury, or heaven forbid, death. So the whole goal is you want the traveler, volunteer, participant to be aware of all the risks involved, so that they can, then make what we call informed consent, or an informed decision to go on this trip. All right, so, we've done the diligence, we've educated our travelers. We'll talk about the documents in a second that are required, but, the other thing I like to tell clients is always have a response plan, okay? You have to assess the risks of where you're going and think about what your response plan will look like. And when I say a response plan, there are really two elements to this, right? It's like, okay, think about the third parties that are involved in this. So if there is an emergency, who do I contact? The consulate, what kind of medical response will I get while I'm in this foreign jurisdiction? What does their healthcare system look like, et cetera, et cetera. And then also your response, right? So how will you react? Who within your company, organization, take the lead in case there's an issue? Who will be responsible? If you've informed, for example, your participant, hey, medical care in this country we're going to, it's a third world country, it might not be up to par, something goes wrong due to something, that the provider does in this country, that's one thing. But if you yourself are in panic mode, you don't have a plan to get to the provider to begin with, or contact the provider, that's a whole different ballgame. So, you need to have a thorough response plan, both internally, and then assess what that'll look like in practice. Okay. Again, this response plan is a bit more heightened in the COVID era, right? On the one hand, there's so much about the disease that we don't know, right? But on the other hand, it is a pandemic. At this point, what we're seeing is it's been around for 2-3 years. So you really can't rely on the fact that, oh my gosh, this is catching me by surprise. So you should have some sort of protocol specifically for COVID, and in terms of how you're going to respond if and when someone in your travel party does catch COVID. What do we do? How do we get them back, or do we quarantine them? Those kinds of things. If practical, not just for COVID, but any kind of response plan that you're thinking about, conduct some trial runs and act out some scenarios. Obviously that might not be possible in terms of, there's some situations that they're just going to happen on the ground. that you really can't prepare for, but you do want to have some run through internally to know who's going to be responsible for what, have some practice situations and conduct some trial runs just so that you're not caught by surprise. So, this kind of dovetails this slide in the very first slide, in terms of, we talked about the liabilities, what are some other risks involved? I won't get into too detail here, but we'll just run through them. Financial risks, obviously, and we'll talk about what role insurance and waivers can play in this. But, you might have medical expenses for overseas treatment, medical evacuation, repatriation of the volunteer or traveler back to their domestic country. You might have other legal, personnel, and reputational risks, right? I mean, obviously, there's a huge reputational risk involved if something does go wrong. Duty of care legislation. This is sort of the negligence and the charitable immunization discussion we had earlier. Some states do not recognize this. And so even though you are a Georgia nonprofit, or you may be a Georgia nonprofit, just know that doesn't necessarily protect you from all scenarios. I gave you the example of what happens if a participant is from another state that doesn't have a charitable immunization, but also you might have it, in the course of running your mission or your trip, you might have a sister company abroad or a sister nonprofit abroad that you work with, and then we get into cross-jurisdictional issues, et cetera. So, you just got to be mindful of it. Workforce engagement and performance could decline. It might not be an issue for nonprofits, but obviously there is some kind of goodwill associated here. So to the extent, there are numerous incidences or whatnot, maybe you're not a great place for a worker to join and work with you. And then negative perception, dovetails with the reputational risks, obviously. There's negative perception in terms of inherently traveling in a country that might be dangerous, but there are also negative perceptions for you as an organization. So there's some risks involved here. Okay, so now let's get to the fun stuff, right? The essential documents, and these are items you're probably all somewhat familiar with, and this is probably the most important part of the presentation, right? So we're generally going to talk about releases and waivers, emergency contact and medical information forms, and then medical release and power of attorney. So the release and waiver, you call this any number of things: a waiver of liability, a release, et cetera, et cetera. What this is basically a written statement where the volunteer or participant will agree to assume the risk of injury inherent in the travel. And in the course of this document, they'll also release you as the organization from liability for any injuries that he or she might sustain while they're on that trip. Again, call it a release or a waiver or a consent form or any combination of those. So the process used to obtain this waiver is important. What we want to do is demonstrate that it was obtained voluntarily without any pressure or coercion by the organization. And it also is a precondition to participating on the trip or the mission. We want to make sure that the releases are tailored to the specific trip. And one question I get all the time in terms of this is who signs this, right? So oftentimes what happens in trips is, and this is more on the for-profit world, but I've seen it sometimes in the non-for-profit world, is like you'll have a group go, right? And then one person will sign a waiver on behalf of the group, or one person will at least book the trip or whatnot on behalf of the group. And the question I get is, well, does everyone have to sign, or is it okay for the lead quote unquote booker or the lead person to just sign? And I say, belts and braces, again, it's preferable for everyone to sign. And it's because, God forbid, something happens. If only one person signs and something happens to someone else in the group who didn't sign, well, then you don't have a release and waiver on behalf of those other people. And you're sort of relying on a he said, she said argument where, okay, did the person who didn't sign, were they informed of all these risks by the lead person at all? Or did they even read this? Or did they really have authority to sign on behalf of the person who didn't sign? And I've had this happen, right? And I'll use another anecdote for in the for-profit world. One of my clients specialized in, we'll call it student vacation or student travel abroad. And they had a very robust set of terms and conditions that made it very crystal clear that, from X time to Y time, you are our responsibility. You can only do these things. These are the rules. But once, midnight strikes on Saturday, we have no responsibility, and you're free to do whatever you want on in your free time. But you're going to release us from anything you do because that's all your responsibility and whatnot. And we have no control over that. And so a group goes and they go to basically a cliff somewhere in the coast of Italy. And they all start, and this is all recorded, by the way, people had the camera phones out. And they're jumping off the cliff. And one kid jumped off, and it's very harrowing. I've seen the video, and he never came back up. He ended up drowning. And there was a lawsuit filed, and insurance was involved, and my client fortunately had a very leading litigator in these types of accidents involved, and came to me and said, you guys are very fortunate. And I thought he was talking about the robust set of terms and conditions, and he said, that was good, but the key thing was everyone signed that release and waiver, because there was a lead quote unquote booker involved, who booked the trip, right? And the client in this case made sure that all the other people in that group signed the release and waiver. And so, again, backing up to the whole point of the story, if you have a release and waiver, make sure everyone who's actually participating signs that release and waiver. So what's in that release and waiver? If you want to disclose the risks and assumptions of travel. So for example, if a mission trip involves going to a red light district in Thailand, you want to specify the expected risks and warnings in writing. Or, let's say you're fixing houses in the Appalachian region, describe the expected construction skills and what the risks are that are involved. In addition, if you want to state up front all the physical requirements for each participant. Do you have any requirement where they have to handle high altitudes if you're going to Machu Picchu, for example? Extreme weather conditions? Are there any other special precautions needed? Why do you want to make all these disclosures? Well, by doing so, your release document in effect becomes what's called an informed release and waiver. So you're informing the participant of all the risks involved. There's no argument there that they could say, well, I didn't know this trip would involve these risks. And so that makes it more likely to be legally enforceable if there's ever an issue. Also, it's just good business practice. It helps everyone understand the actual risks and expectations involved. And that way, your participants, or if they're underage, their parents can better evaluate whether this is the right kind of trip for them. As I said, I've worked with the PBPA before on numerous releases and waivers. They do have forms. They have attorneys who can help and draft these for your organizations. One warning though, language here is very nuanced. It's very important. So a lot of times you might get a participant or someone participating in a trip or a volunteer. They'll see your release and waiver, they'll mark it up, edit it, and send it back to you. Our general advice is don't agree to those edits or changes. The reason your form is because we've tailored your specific trip requirements into that form. If there are any edits or changes, we recommend that you run it by your attorney or advisor before agreeing to them. Another important thing, most waivers of liability are designed to prevent future legal claims. So any injuries for which you might otherwise have legal responsibility for, and things that you might not necessarily be insured for, this waiver will protect you for that. So they play an important role in protecting your funds, ensuring those funds are used for your mission rather than in defending legal claims. But it's not the end all be all. We should also look at insurance, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. Remember that the whole concept of charitable immunity before we leave this slide. Again, you don't necessarily have to have a written waiver of liability, particularly if you're in a state that recognizes charitable immunity. But as I said, charitable immunity in Georgia has some limitations and exceptions. So that's why we require, or we strongly recommend that you require your volunteers to execute these waivers. It's just, again, even if the risk of injury is small, or a claim is small, seeking these may prevent you from being held liable in the future. And it's just a good tool to have in your belt. It's, why not have the proverbial 2 bites at the apple, as I say. All right, another form that's really common: emergency contact and medical information. Emergency contact, kind of self-explanatory. You at least want to have your volunteer participant to have at least one emergency contact in the US in case anything goes wrong. Usually you kind of see these forms attached to the waiver and release. Another suggestion is for the participants themselves to inform their parents, guardians, families, next of kin that, hey, this is where we're going, and maybe they have a reciprocal emergency contact on the charitable organization side that these family members can reach out to if there's an emergency at home. Keeping on with this, the medical information, you want to get some kind of background of medical information on your participants in case there's a need for treatment on the ground. You also want to consider they might have some other health circumstances in terms of if you have criteria before you accept someone from participating in a trip. So, again, using the Machu Picchu example, for example, let's say you're going in a place for high altitude. You kind of want to know, maybe get a physical checkup required from a doctor, or sign off from a doctor that the participant is physically able to participate in the trip. But in general terms, any medical conditions they might have, disabilities, physical limitations, any other conditions, et cetera, you want to be aware of those. And then also, as I said at the beginning, for a point of entry might require immunizations, inoculations, and vaccines. And also other shots that you might need. And also, are there any required medications that they need to have in terms of the trip? Now, that doesn't mean you're responsible for providing those medications, but, God forbid there's an emergency and you have to present this information to a doctor on the ground. It's always good to have. Again, these forms, PBPA should have them. And I've worked with them in crafting these. A lot of people are concerned about HIPAA. These are forms that are like HIPAA release forms. So the provider, as long as the participant gives their consent to the provider can give this information to you. Okay. Medical release and power of attorney, it's a little bit different than a medical information form. Okay, and again, the release aspect you can build in your general release and waiver, and that basically means, like, look, if there's any action here on the ground that where we're responsible, or if there's an emergency situation, you give this authority to render the first aid, to act on your behalf. In terms of securing medical treatments, et cetera, et cetera. If we do that, you're releasing us from any liability. Okay, we're not responsible for the cost or quality of any treatment or care. And not only if we do that, but just a general release will also say, hey, the country we're going to, the level of care is a lot different than what's in the US. Medical care might not be readily available. We might have to travel X amount of hours for the nearest treatment center. We're not on the hook for that. So it'll have some built-in language there. Power of attorney, slightly different than a medical release. The idea here is, and this is both true in the US and also abroad, like many hospitals and doctors will not treat, let's say, minors, for example, if they're presented by someone who isn't a parent or guardian, right? They won't do it without a power of attorney. Even if for adults, right? If the injured party is incoherent, for example, and they need direction on treatment or some kind of financial security, like, hey, you need to sign these paperwork, who's going to be financially responsible, et cetera, et cetera. If the adult non-minor is incoherent, someone needs to sign off on that, and the next of kin is not there. So this power of attorney usually grants the nonprofit the right to do these things. So that's the third point on the slide here, right? You have the right to render first aid, you have the right to act on their behalf, to get the medical treatment and medicines, and then you have the right to act on their behalf in accepting financial responsibility. So it's a really important document, particularly when you're traveling abroad. All right, so I mentioned, the insurance plays a role in all of this. Medical release, a general release and waiver gives you some amount of financial protection, but you should also consult with your insurance broker about what insurance you may want to consider purchasing in conjunction with this waiver of liability and this trip. In general, the first policy you're going to think about purchasing is a comprehensive general liability policy. I call it a CGL policy. You probably already have one, right? And it is exactly what you would think it is. And it insures a nonprofit if you're sued by anyone for personal injury that the person might suffer as a result of the negligent acts or omissions of you, the nonprofit. So you probably already have a commercial general liability policy. Typically, international coverage can be added on, or you can purchase as a separate international CGL policy. So you might want to, ask your existing provider, hey, if something happens abroad, am I covered under the CGL? A lot of nonprofits are concerned that maybe that general liability policy may not protect the volunteers if they're injured. In that case, maybe, you want to add on an international workers' comp if they're working for you. Usually what this policy will do is cover the volunteer in the case he or she is injured while volunteering. It'll reimburse that volunteer for any uninsured medical expenses, et cetera, et cetera. So, you might want to look into, and this will primarily come into play if there's any gap in your general liability coverage. Then you have travel accident and evacuation coverage. It's a little bit different than trip insurance, which we'll talk about in a second. But travel accident is kind of a specialized type of travel insurance or trip insurance plan. Essentially what it does is it acts as life insurance and insurance against accidental death in the case of an accident. And then to piggyback off of that, you have medical evacuation insurance. So that pays for the cost of emergency transportation to the nearest adequate treatment center. Or, maybe the person has to be transported back to the US if necessary. And they got to pay for the fly back home. Typically that'll be covered under evacuation coverage. This is something I advise both the nonprofit and the volunteer to look into. A lot of nonprofits will have that evacuation coverage in there. That's part of their international general liability policy. But, I think it's a good idea for the organization and the actual traveler to look into this type of coverage. And sometimes for the individual, this might be covered by their credit card and their own, trip insurance, which we'll talk about in a second. And then for you, the organization, as I said, it might be covered under your general liability, but if not, look into it as a supplemental coverage. Then you have trip insurance or travel insurance. It comes down to two buckets. You have the medical, which is basically your health insurance coverage abroad. Again, this can be for the individual bundled with any number of things. Maybe it's part of their travel accident insurance. Maybe it's part of their health insurance plan domestically where they have international coverage. And then, there's also the financial aspect of trip insurance, which is the financial investment in a trip, lost luggage, trip cancellation, et cetera. This is more for the individual traveler, but I mention it here because some countries will require some form of travel insurance. Not necessarily the financial aspect, but the medical aspect. before entering. So just be aware of it. And again, like I said, a lot of times both the medical and the financial buckets are covered for an individual through their credit card or maybe their own current health insurance coverage. All right, so as we wrap this up, what are some of the checklists that we like to go through? And I'll run through some stuff for both the nonprofit and the traveler. And some of this is interchangeable and applies to both. But look at your travel warnings and alerts as you craft the trip and as you solicit volunteers and participants. And these days that would include what the COVID protocols are, the point of entry requirements, quarantine requirements, what happens in terms of when we get back to the US and whatnot. Form some sort of contingency plan, things, backup plan, what happens if something goes wrong. Again, using COVID as an example, what happens if someone gets COVID? Maybe you're going within a country to several different cities and different legs in the span of a month. If one person gets COVID, how does that impact the balance of the trip? What are you going to do? Do you quarantine them and then quarantine everyone else separately and move on with the trip? Do you wait for their quarantine to expire? Those types of things. Orientations, I always recommend have a pre-trip orientation and have one on the ground, but do one at least so that everyone's on the same page in terms of what the requirements are, what the risks are, and that people have an opportunity to ask questions, right? Contact information. Have a lead person responsible for these contingency plans on the ground. And you want contact information from the traveler, and you want the traveler to have some sort of contact information for you that they can relay back home to their family members. Documents, again, releases, I use that as a broad term that includes the emergency contact information, the medical releases, and the medical power of attorney. So please have those documents ready. Insurance, check with your insurance brokers as to what coverage you have, what gaps there may need that there may be that you may need to fill, et cetera. And then background checks, do some kind of diligence on your suppliers, your workers on the ground in that foreign country. And if you can, even your volunteers domestically that are going to, join you and work with you abroad. For the actual travelers, health insurance, do you have sufficient coverage? Do you need to get more coverage? Immunizations, especially now with the COVID vaccinations, do you have what's required for entry? Make sure your passports and visas are up to date. Copies of documentation, you want to bring copies of your immunization forms, your passport and visas, basic medical records in case there's any treatment that's required. Bring your extra medication and prescriptions for the trip. You might be in a country where things are not readily available if you run out of medicine. So you might want to bring an extra supply or at least a prescription that you can get filled. Contact information, make sure that the nonprofit has adequate contact information in case anything goes wrong. As I said, orientation, highly recommend some form of orientation, either pre-trip or on the ground. Ask questions if you're the nonprofit traveler from the nonprofit, who's responsible for what. There's no question that should be off limits if you're the nonprofit, right? You want as much information discussed on the front end as possible, and think through the logistics, what's going to be required and the risks involved in those logistics. Keeping this continued, and this is the checklist that you get from the nonprofit. You want their emergency contact information, medical information, releases. We talked about the in-country orientation. What are your goals and expectations on both sides? Let's communicate all the contingency plans that there might need to be, and this will be the typical, okay, if there's a crime emergency, here's where's the nearest consulate is, here are the consulate numbers, here's a person you contact within the nonprofit, those types of things. And then if there are any independent travelers joining down, some portion of the trip or later, maybe this volunteer says, oh, my parent is joining, 3 weeks from now. Try to get their itineraries. This goes both for the traveler and the nonprofit, just so you know. You're not necessarily going to be liable if you're the nonprofit for these independent travelers, particularly if you have a robust set of terms and conditions. But, sorry, but, again, like where this gets tricky is if the independent traveler, tricky for the nonprofit, is joining you, they didn't sign the waiver and lease. Maybe you're hosting them in your hostel, your hotel, and they're sort of, become by osmosis part of the trip. And that's a gray area, right? So, if they are coming, if they are going to be involved, you want to know as a nonprofit, and you kind of want to make sure they sign the waiver and lease just as a belts and braces. So, it's always a good idea. All right, that's all I had. I'll open it for questions if anyone has one.
Hey, Suhail, that was fantastic information. We do have a few questions. One of them goes back to the section about release and waiver. Is there a distinction between volunteers, board members, and employees when signing the waiver?
No, because ultimately they're all going to have the same inherent risks involved. So volunteers and employees and board members, if they're engaging in this trip, you can't have a one size fits all release and waiver that says, look, I mean, we're the nonprofit organization. We have planned this trip out. Here are the risks involved, but we're not going to be liable for any of them, right? You know the risk going in before you sign up for this, and that's it. And that's essentially what the form says.
Mm-hmm. And we do have some other questions that were actually included in pre-registration, but for our live audience, if y'all have any more questions, feel free to put them in chat. We had a couple of people ask about considerations for when youth are traveling. Are there additional risks, financial or insurance, if the volunteers, they put them in quotes, are teenagers or young adults?
So again, there's a heightened risk, duty of care when young adults are involved, but you could mitigate that risk through the release and waiver. What you have to do there, though, however, is have the parent and guardian sign that release and waiver, and make sure the parent and guardian have what we call the informed consent. So make sure they know the risks involved. And the idea is they have been able to assess it and determine, okay, yay or nay, this trip is safe or not safe for my child, and I'm voluntarily releasing that child to your custody by signing this waiver and release.
And do you have recommendations on the level of travel insurance that a nonprofit should ask their participants to carry individually?
No, so it varies. No, I don't. I could tell you what I've seen. There is typically a minimum is like $50,000 coverage. And a lot of this varies by jurisdiction, right? There's some countries that have mandatory travel insurance requirements and they'll have minimum thresholds. Others say, no, just have whatever. What I've seen typically on the low end is 50,000. If someone is going to say like a polar region or Antarctica or something that's like super risky, then I've seen like the $150,000, $200,000 limits, but it varies. It'll just vary depending on where you're going and what the risks are.
Okay, and this next question is not such a legal question, but since you have so much experience in this area, you may have some insight. Do you have any resources or suggestions on educating staff and volunteers on cultural norms / sensitivities?
So I think the State Department website does a good job. They not only do they do the risks, the level risk, but there's sort of like a encyclopedia where you can get country information, and they'll provide. It's not as robust or detailed as you'd like to see, but they do provide some guidance on some cultural issues in terms of the point of entry where you're traveling. There are some books out there. The internet's a good resource, frankly. There's a lot of doing business in X country books, and they're good guides because they generally not only dive into detail on the actual nitty gritty of business terms, but they also provide, a chapter or two on what the cultural norms are. And that's it serves as a good source, a good idea, at least, of what to expect.
And one participant or one viewer is asking, can we require certain vaccines such as COVID, typhoid, yellow fever, or medications such as malaria for their participation by volunteers?
I mean, yeah, you're no different than a private employer, right? You could, if you're a private organization, you could require, it's a private nonprofit, you could require certain vaccines. There's a risk to that, obviously. It's such a hot button issue. A volunteer might not say, might say, look, it's not required for that country. Why are you requiring it from me? You have to look at your risks and the end games. Like, do you want to deter volunteers from joining the mission? If that is your end game, is to have a lot of volunteers participate in the mission. So if it's not required, there is a risk in you requiring it if it's not required in that country.
Okay. Thank you, Suhail. That is all of the questions that we have gotten so far. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, and well, for all that you do for PBPA and our nonprofit clients. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. But
Thank you for having me.
One more question.
Okay,
If you
go
have a
for it.
minute. Our viewers asking, can we ask volunteers to have physicians give them a bill of approval to travel to a particular country, especially if it's a developing country?
Yeah, I mean, yes. Long and the short of it is in that medical form that you require the physicians to sign, you can have, hey, we need a physician to sign off that you're fit and able to travel in this country. Usually I see that in countries where you actually have to be physically fit, as I said, like Machu Picchu, high altitude or whatnot. But there's no prohibition in you suggesting that they do so for any reason.
All right, fantastic. And for our viewers who have signed in today to watch, there will be this recording and the slides available on our website in a couple of days. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And thank you so much again, Suhail, once again, for everything you do for PBPA. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this installment of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.